Today we have the honor, the privilege to have with us Andreas Schleicher. He is the Director for Education and Skills and Special Advisor on Education Policy to the Secretary General at the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, in Paris. As a key member of the OECD senior management team, Mr. Schleicher supports the Secretary General's strategy to produce analysis and policy advice that advances economic growth and social progress. He promotes the work of the Directorate for Education and Skills on a global stage and fosters cooperation both within and outside the OECD. The OECD supervises the OECD Survey of Adult Skills, the OECD Teaching and Learning International Survey, and the development of analysis of benchmarks on the performance of education systems. Before joining the OECD, Mr. Schleicher was Director for Analysis at the International Association for Education Achievement. He studied physics in Germany and received a degree in mathematics and statistics in Australia. He is the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including the Theodor Heuss Prize, awarded in the name of the first President of the Federal Republic of Germany for exemplary democratic engagement. He holds an honorary professorship at the University of Heidelberg. But above all, we know him as the PISA man. When he speaks, all the wheels stop. When he talks about the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA. From his position, he has a privileged view of trends, bumps, and serious crises and particulars of the world of education. This is why today he will enlighten us about educating learners for their future, not our past. Please welcome Dr. Schleicher.
Thank you so much for inviting me to the virtual Educa. It's a pleasure to share some thoughts with you this morning. And I'm just sharing my screen with you. These are obviously very difficult times for education. We should be cognizant of this. We have 1.5 billion young people who have been locked out of their schools for some time at least. And the one thing they learned from this experience is that learning is not a place. It's an activity. And education and technology must work together better in the future. Remote learning has sort of become the lifeline for the success of learning, but we've also seen it doesn't address the many social functions of schooling, and I think that poses enormous challenges. We've also seen that while technology holds the great promise to become an equalizer, making learning more granular, more differentiated, more adaptive, more responsive to individual learning needs, actually reality has been that it has amplified inequality in this crisis. Those young people who have learned to learn, who had the right parental support, who had access to great resources, technology, for them this experience has been liberating and exciting. But for those without those resources, without that support, and who had in the past been spoon-fed by their teachers, for them this has been a very, very difficult time. So I think we've learned a lot of lessons from this crisis. And of course, when you think about this, a lot of learning time has been lost. A lot of learning opportunity has been lost. When we surveyed the 36 countries of the OECD, we found that only about 40% of the curriculum has been delivered. Now, teachers were more optimistic. Now, that's great. Teachers have said, well, maybe I couldn't teach so much mathematics and science, but actually my students became more independent. They developed a lot of social emotional skills, resilience. So, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but reality is big learning gaps remain. When you think about what countries have tried to achieve, on the one hand, it's about academic learning. That's been the focus of learning in this crisis. But look at the other bars. They're almost equally long. Providing professional support and advice to teachers. Providing just-in-time professional development for teachers. Ensuring the social development of students. assessment, and supporting parents, ensuring the well-being of students, the well-being of teachers. Many things that often are in the shadows of education have somehow become to the forefront, becoming almost important as academic learning. So this crisis has shifted priorities, sort of giving attention to a more holistic kind of perspective on education, making education almost a whole of society project rather than just, a public service project. And when you look at, technology has played a hugely important role. Over 90% of the countries have used some form of online instructional resources when schools were closed. But look at the orange part. Most of that learning was not, magic, adaptive, artificially intelligence-driven kind of platforms, actually. Most of that learning was simply technology-mediated direct instruction. So let's not become over-enthusiastic by technology in education right now. Most of this has actually been, like we're doing now, talking through Zoom. And then television, radio have also played an important role. But technology is somehow becoming to the forefront, but it's not yet used as effectively as it probably could be. And of course, technology is always only as good as it's actually being used. We carried out in 2018 our Thales survey of teachers. And what you can see here is that only about half of the teachers are reasonably comfortable with using technology and use it frequently or always for projects or classwork. It looks better in countries like Denmark, New Zealand, Australia, the United Arab Emirates. Now, their technology is very frequently deployed. But look at the right hand of the chart. One of the most high-tech countries like Japan, teachers are not yet ready for the digital world. What's also interesting, there's been a lot of change. When you look at the red dot, which was the same thing 5 years earlier, you could see in countries like Sweden, like Israel, like Finland, like Croatia, the share of technology use, teachers using it frequently, has almost doubled or more than doubled in 5 years period. So actually many education systems are on their way to bring their teachers along, but we are not yet there. It's only about half of the teachers who are now ready for actually or use technology quite frequently. Now, let's look forward. That's our session is about how do we educate young people for their own future rather than for our past. Let's look forward to what, learning could look like. What's very important, of course, is to reconcile in the post-pandemic period health considerations with educational considerations. Of course, schools need to be safe environments. What you can see from the chart here, research from previous epidemics suggested schools are not, a major contributor to the spread of the virus. No? When you want to, contain the spread of the virus, you're much better off, focusing on workplace social distancing, on case isolation, on household quarantine, and so on. School closures can only make a modest contribution to the spread of the virus. But when we reopen them, we need to make sure that they are safe environments. And what you can see actually, many countries are actually focusing on this. Training students, teachers on hygiene and using social distancing protocols, closing common areas in schools. There's a lot of effort being put into making schools safe environments. But, that raises the big question, how can we reconcile social distancing with innovative 21st century pedagogy? How do you do project-based learning when students have to sit on, remote places? How do you have group-based learning, interactive kind of pedagogies? Very, very difficult to achieve. Some do that outdoors, where environments are safer, but actually also there, we need to look at, technology in new ways, using technology for the kind of learning environments that are now very difficult to achieve in the traditional schooling setting. Maybe schooling makes direct instruction easier in these days, but so the interactive pedagogies then we should look at to do in other kind of spaces and places. And that's exactly what we see emerging. When we surveyed countries, you can see less than a quarter of countries are going to go back to where they came from, returning to normal scheduling and student attendance. Most countries need to make difficult choices. When schools need to do social distancing, they cannot run at full capacity. They have to, decide, who do I teach on site? Who do I teach online? What you can see here is that over half of the cases are looking to hybrid learning as the future. And that means integrating the real world and the digital world in learning environments. Not sequentially, not deciding, today I teach you online, tomorrow I teach you on site, but thinking about, what student for what purpose will benefit from what kind of learning environment best. Those are very, very difficult decisions, but you can see hybrid learning is probably to be becoming the norm. In fact, one of the countries that was first struck by the virus, Singapore, they concluded very early on, let's introduce an online learning day in the regular schooling curriculum, even if we don't need it for physical reasons. Online learning has been a great tool to strengthen, students' independence, to sort of have them set their own learning goals, manage their own learning process, monitor learning, become the authors of the learning, develop student agency. So now it's becoming part of the regular curriculum. That's an example of hybrid models, and they become basically very, very prevalent. E-learning readiness, this is about training teachers, making teachers, comfortable with securing internet content connectivity, invest in updating or creating effective e-learning platforms. That's actually also interesting that, often it's only a minority of schools that are actually connected in the kind of learning platforms that facilitate, the sharing of education resources, teacher professional collaboration, all those kinds of things. So let's sort of keep just one thing in mind. Technology is not about replacing teachers. Technology can actually, technology is nothing but a great amplifier, a great accelerator. It can amplify innovative teaching. It cannot replace very traditional teaching. And that's something that we need to keep in mind, sort of how do we integrate, the human and the kind of virtual world. Basically, learning is not a transactional experience. Learning is always a relational experience. And in a way, what it can do, what technology can do, is actually take away from teachers the kind of administrative and standardized kind of forms of work that are not that interesting and that maybe not that important for the future. And it can enhance the role of teachers as good coaches, good mentors, good facilitators, good evaluators. And the history of that is not that long. It's just about a decade ago when we got all those little devices into our hands. And then soon after, the virtual world and the real world became integrated and everybody got connected. Now, that is not a long history that we're talking about. No? But if you look at today's 15-year-olds in the PISA assessment, more than half of them said they feel really bad if they're not connected to the internet. Being connected has become almost like, drinking water or breathing air. Very, very important. But, technology is important in our lives, but in education is only a tiny part. Look at, compare education and health. Health has an amazing kind of technological industry. If you go to a hospital today, you'll find the most modern technology. You'll find surgeons working with hybrid kind of technologies and everything. If you look at the market capitalization in the field of education, the education industry is tiny. You can virtually not see it even on the chart. Only in less than 3% of global educational expenditure today is on technology. So, education is still far away from the world that we see in other areas. We expect that to change. Now, when you compare, 2018 with 2025, we expect to grow, technology expenditure a lot in absolute terms and even in relative terms. So it's probably going to be a bigger part of the pie, but still very modest. Even in the next years to come, probably we are going to see just modest increases. Where is the money going to go to? Well, virtual reality, augmented reality are the dominant part. This is about, giving students access to a virtual laboratory, having them do an experiment rather than just listening to the results of an experiment. We can see amazing examples today of virtual reality basically providing innovative, interesting, engaging learning environments. Artificial intelligence, robotics, and a little bit of blockchain. Let me, show you some examples in a moment. But first of all, where is that, investment being made? It's actually really interesting. And most of this is coming from one single country, and that is China. You can see basically today the United States and China are sort of still quite, or in 2015, they were still sort of pretty much uneven. But in 2018, you could see already 63% of global education venture capital being coming from China. Huge, and you can see that in classrooms. There you can see really teachers, and actually what's interesting, it's not technology companies running schools. It's actually most of that development is actually initiated, supported, and carried through by teachers. Teachers spending maybe less time teaching than a Spanish or European teacher or American teacher, but more time working with their colleagues on designing innovative learning environments, using new technology, and so on. And of course, the potential is to greater personalization of learning, and there are a lot of examples for this already happen. Technology can follow students at their own pace. It can recognize how different students learn things differently, what they get interested in, bored with, and so on. We can see actually a lot of this being happen, but it requires actually teachers who are aware of differences in student needs. So if deploying those technologies effectively poses huge challenges for teachers. But I think this kind of personalized learning agenda is now quite real. Assessment and exams, I think the time of bubble sheets where students, clicked or crossed, one of four answers is over. Basically, now we can do assessments and exams that, integrate virtual reality into assessment, that become adaptive, that also allow the assessment of practical skills, vocational skills, that great, open-ended task where students write or produce open-ended exercises, and the computer basically will interpret them appropriately. In the medical sector, again, that's very advanced. You can do operations, you can try operations in a virtual environment, and so on. So assessment and examination will become much more advanced with technology. Also, in the past, assessment was sort of stealing time from learning. You had to reserve some time for testing, and that was just, giving students scores. Today, you can integrate the world of learning and the world of assessment. Assessment can provide real-time feedback for students, helping students to learn better, teachers to teach better, schools to become more effective. In fact, I can tell you, in the latest PISA assessment, the more interesting results didn't come from, whether students get the answers right or wrong. They came from how students got the answers. We can track actually the solution strategies that students deploy and learn a lot about pedagogy. Even in a classroom, you find that, from 30 students, 20 actually have a certain misconception about an idea. You can suddenly visualize, see it, and then adapt your teaching strategy. So I think it's a very, very important part of the agenda. Classroom analytics. In Asia, you can see very interesting examples, where actually learning analytics studies student behavior. It can watch them, but it can also look at the student responses, and then provide very powerful data systems that help teachers understand when should I advance, do something new, have my students understood, completed the exercise, are they getting bored by what I'm saying, am I losing their attention, how should I structure my instruction time. You can make actually teaching much more responsive through classroom analytics. Of course, there are big questions around this. I don't want to hide this, basically data privacy and, learning analytics, there is a tension, and I think we have a lot of work in front to resolve it, but I think that's where the future is. Robotics, A lot of talk about it. I must say, I have not seen so great examples of this, mainly, in the area of teaching coding or computational thinking. That's where robotics is quite prevalent, students programming something and then they see a robot doing that. But, maybe in the future we see more of social robots that take on the roles of teaching aids, tutors, peers. We don't know. I think that's an area where probably more needs to be done. And then last but not least, blockchain. I think that technology has huge potential in helping us preserve integrity of education. Particularly when assessment will become more granular or when learning will give learners more discretion over what they learn, how they learn, when they learn, and where they learn. Now, when that happens, I think we will need much better technologies to keep sort of track of student learning instances. At the moment, degrees and qualifications are very lumpy. You study for a whole year and then you do a test and then you get a credential. In the future, much smaller chunks of learning will be accumulated, and someone needs to keep track of this. And this is where blockchain technology probably can do a big contribution. But as you could see, it's only in its infancy in the field of education. Now, this was about the role that technology can play and can help in education. But we should look at the other side of the coin as well. What should we teach in a world of artificial intelligence? Look at basically how the world has changed through technology between the early 2000s and the year 2018. And 2000, when you think about literacy was largely about reading books. When we did our first assessment in PISA in the year 2000, we studied reading printed text, not because that was the dominant form of reading. And when you didn't know the answer to a question, you could look it up in an encyclopedia. And you could always trust that answer to be true. Well, today, in our latest assessment, my students didn't know the answer to a question, they can look it up in Google, but they get 100,000 answers to their question. And nobody will tell them what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not true. Literacy is no longer about extracting knowledge, which is easy to teach. It's about constructing knowledge. So the construct of literacy has fundamentally changed. But if you look at actually the evolution of education, hasn't really advanced very much. Basically, the scores on average in the industrialized world haven't really changed by a large margin. That's quite distressing. In a rapidly changing world, our education systems do not change. And if you look, actually, only about 1 in 10 students was able to distinguish a fact from an opinion in a complex setting, of course. You say, well, that's better than in the year 2000, where it was 7%. But think about, we live in a radically changing world. So, the world is changing, education systems are not adapting to this. Of course, some countries have advanced a lot. The 4 provinces of China that took part are now #1. You can see a country like Singapore moving from good to great, or Estonia, one of the poorest countries in Europe, actually, advancing to the frontier in the OECD, or Portugal. Here also, who would have thought in the year 2000 that Portugal would be actually a good performer in the OECD area? Poland, none of those success stories. Or you look at the lower end of the spectrum, countries like Peru or Albania. You can look at Brazil, maybe not so impressive in overall outcomes, or Turkey. But what they have achieved is getting at least a lot more young people to participate in education. Or you can look at a country like Sweden that used to be, the star performer and saw a decline and decline and decline, but somehow it catches the ball and actually moves back to success, which also shows us we can change those dynamics. Unfortunately, we haven't seen that many countries with those kinds of positive dynamics. In most countries, actually, the world has remained pretty flat. Performance has remained pretty flat, and that is what gets us there. Some people say, well, just let's add more time to learning. Give students more learning time. And you can see there's huge variation in the amount of time that students study. In school in blue and out of school in yellow. You can see the United Arab Emirates. Students spend close to 60 hours per week learning. You can contrast this with Finland on the left side, where it's a little bit more than half of that time. Yeah, but when you look at productivity, you can see that students in Finland learn a lot in very little time, whereas students in the United Arab Emirates spend a lot of time and learn very little. So it's not about time. It's not even about money. It's how we actually use that student time to facilitate really good learning. Our education systems don't suffer from a shortage of learning time. They suffer from poor productivity in learning environments. You know, I just showed you that learning time is not a great predictor for learning outcomes, but here is a good predictor for learning outcomes. And that's the growth mindset that young people have. You know, if you look to Estonia, number 1 in the OECD in learning outcomes, number 1 in the OECD in that mindset of students where they take ownership of their success, where they see their success in themselves rather than, you know, in talent or in genes or in a social context. You look at Indonesia here, they're not doing well on either front now. So fostering that growth mindset is going to be one of the prerequisites for advancing education in the 21st century. And it's not just about performance. You can see students with a stronger growth mindset were more motivated to master difficult tasks. They had a greater sense of self-efficacy. They were less afraid of failure. They set more ambitious learning goals and they saw greater value in schooling. So once again, you know, we often pay a lot of attention to the cognitive attributes. We need to pay more attention to the social emotional outcomes, including growth mindset. Learning is expanding exponentially, and it's filled with so many facets and ideas that we could learn, that we could teach. But all of those ideas are connected with people. Again, learning is always a relational aspect. The subject where you invested most of your energy in primary school was maybe the subject where you had a teacher who really understood your dreams, your aspirations, and was able to recognize how you learn. So that's very, very important. And the kind of world of the curriculum is so small compared to the rich world around us. And we try to squeeze everything into this little box of the curriculum. But what happens is that when we do that, what ends up in the box is often a very shallow shadow of the true features of learning. If you look, you know, young people in Spain in primary school, they all love science. It's about observing nature, you know, experimenting. It's about trying things out. When you survey them again at age 15, many of them hate science. It's become a boring world of formulas and equations that actually has very little to do with the nature of scientific inquiry. But, you know, we are putting more and more and more and more things into this little box, and we end up teaching, you know, things that are a mile wide but just an inch deep, you know, teaching lots of stuff at very shallow depths. The question really is how we can focus more on the kind of things that make us human. This is what artificial intelligence really does. It pushes us to think much harder about what makes us human. How do we complement, not substitute, the artificial intelligence we have created in our computers? Student agency will be at the heart of this. Students who take true ownership, you know, who see themselves and their individual work and their colleagues as a success. And knowledge, yes, disciplinary knowledge will always be important, but deep epistemic understanding is of even greater value. Not about, you know, have you learned a lot in physics and chemistry, but can you think like a scientist? Can you design an experiment? Can you distinguish questions that are scientifically investigable from questions that are not? Can you think like an historian? History is not about names and places alone. It's about understanding how the narrative of a society has emerged, how it developed, how it advanced, and how sometimes it unravels when the context changes. Those are the questions of our times. We need to teach fewer things at greater depths. And again, technology can help advance this. But also keep in mind that the world no longer rewards us just for what we know. Google knows everything. The world more and more rewards us for what we can do with what we know. This is about cognitive skills, of course, creativity, critical thinking, and so on. But very importantly, it's also about social and emotional skills. Curiosity, courage, empathy, leadership. Those things are very, very important, increasingly important in the world of artificial intelligence. And some of those social emotional skills are best developed in the very early ages. Later on in life, they become personality traits, character qualities. We can't change it very much. But actually, attention in the early years can actually foster. The 20th century was about, high school and middle school. The 21st century is very much about early learning. So when you ask me, what are the most transformative competencies? And with that, I want to conclude my presentation. Of course, it's about creating new value. That's perhaps what distinguishes us most from the artificial intelligence of our computers. Developing new ideas, connecting the dots where the next innovation is going to come from. But it's also about reconciling tensions and dilemmas. The world is no longer black and white. Often we need to navigate ambiguity, manage uncertainty, resolve complexity. It's, seeing the forest among the trees, stepping back, reflecting. And last but not least, take responsibility. This is not just about what you know and what you can do, but whether you're capable to mobilize your cognitive, social, and emotional resources to do something. Often in life, we know what to do. We're actually also able to do it. But we're still not, putting our act together and getting it done. That's what the future of education really is about. We need to, in this time of artificial intelligence, we need to deploy the technologies to facilitate learning. But we also need to ask ourselves much harder about what is it that makes us human and how can we foster those kinds of knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you for your enlightenment, for your vision, for your optimism. It was really great. Thank you for your time and effort. And regretfully, we are totally out of time. We have received many questions, and we promise that we will respond to them on the platform. I'm sorry we will bother you, Dr. Schleicher, with some questions to follow up so that our audiences really fully grasp your presentation. Wonderful, very inspiring. Thank you. And we have to close the session here. We're out of time again, but we hope to have you again and again many more times. Thank you, Andreas.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you to our audiences, and we will come back with the questions, with responses. Thank you. Bye.